Good evening, survivors. This is Alex Reed from Station 103.7 Voicecast, your voice in the darkness. Tonight, I bring you a chilling story from one of the busiest places in America, an airport that has transformed into a tomb of terror. Just days ago, its bustling gates welcomed travelers from across the world, but now they harbor something far more sinister. A place of connection, movement, and hope has descended into chaos, its heart now beating to the rhythm of fear. Tonight we dive into the harrowing events that unfolded inside those walls, revealing the desperate struggle to survive. Picture this: towering glass windows, once bathed in sunlight, now streaked with blood, their reflections twisted in the dim, flickering lights. Planes stand silent, motionless on the tarmac, their engines forever stilled. Within the labyrinth of terminals, shadows stretch and twist, hiding horrors that lurk just out of sight. Automated announcements echo hollowly in the vast empty spaces, each cheerful chime a bitter reminder of what once was. The scent of jet fuel mingles with the coppery tang of spilled blood. The air is heavy, oppressive, laced with an unshakable sense of dread. Survivors speak of the moment it all began. A routine landing, a passenger coughing faintly as they disembarked, nothing to raise alarm, until the first scream shattered the calm. Panic erupted, a tidal wave of terror, sweeping through the crowd. Security struggled to maintain control, but within moments, the infection spread like wildfire. Travelers became prey, their cries swallowed by the relentless advance of the infected. Every step, every sound, every breath drew the attention of those monstrous beings, their lifeless eyes locked onto their next victim. Families were torn apart in the chaos, hands slipping away in the frantic stampede for safety. Parents searching for their children found only echoes of laughter, now lost to the abyss. Travelers who had been counting down the minutes until their flights now count their heartbeats, each one a prayer that the infected won't hear them. They move in shadows, hugging the walls, desperate to stay one step ahead of their relentless pursuers. Yet, amidst the horror, there is an undeniable strength in every whispered plan, every trembling hand clutching a makeshift weapon. There is hope, a hope that flickers like a candle in a storm, fragile but stubbornly refusing to be extinguished. Survivors find each other, form fragile alliances, and fight for the sliver of a chance to see another sunrise. Their stories are a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, to the bonds that form in the face of despair. Tonight we'll bring you their voices. We'll tell you about the flight attendant who became a beacon of calm amidst the chaos, guiding frightened passengers through the maze of destruction. We'll hear of a parent's desperate quest to find their child, the small clues they followed with unwavering determination. You'll learn about the air traffic controller trapped high above, using their unique vantage point to guide survivors through the deadly corridors below. And then there's the lone traveler, a reluctant hero whose choices will change the course of their lives, and others. This isn't just a tale of terror, it's a call to all of us. A reminder that in the face of the unthinkable, we find strength in each other. We cling to the memories of those we've lost and fight for the ones who still remain. This is more than a broadcast. It's a lifeline for those still out there, hiding, running, fighting. Know that you are not alone. Your story matters. Your survival matters. Stay with us as we uncover the harrowing fight for survival in the airport now known as Ground Zero. Listen closely as we share their strategies, their sacrifices, and their hope. And remember, the key to survival lies in staying calm, moving quietly, and never losing sight of an exit. This is Alex Reed, and you're tuned in to Station 103.7. Tonight, we bear witness to the darkness, but we also illuminate the resilience of the human spirit. Stay strong, survivors. The night is far from over. The airport was a sprawling, cavernous maze, a city within a city, now shrouded in eerie silence. punctuated only by distant echoes of chaos. The vast terminals stretched endlessly, their glass walls revealing grounded plains that seemed like forgotten relics. Lifeless and still, rows of empty seats lined the gates, each one a silent witness to the panic that had erupted just hours before, once filled with the hum of life, laughter, chatter, and the hurried footsteps of travelers rushing to catch their flights. Those spaces now felt cold, lifeless, and heavy with the weight of dread. The long hallways, illuminated by flickering overhead lights, stretched into darkness, their tiled floors smeared with scuff marks, luggage, and ominous streaks of crimson. Abandoned suitcases lay scattered like forgotten memories, their contents spilling onto the floor in chaotic bursts of color, a child's teddy bear here, a businessman's neatly folded suit there. The air felt thick, each breath tainted by the acrid stench of fear, sweat, and something far more unsettling, decay. Moving deeper into the airport, the labyrinthine baggage claim area loomed like a cavern. Conveyor belts, once tirelessly churning out luggage, now stood motionless, their metallic surfaces cold under the dim emergency lighting. Shadows played tricks on the eyes, twisting and shifting as if the walls themselves were alive. Here, the sound of a suitcase wheel creaking across the floor echoed unnaturally, carrying an almost unbearable weight of tension. The baggage carousel, a circular track that had once symbolized the end of a journey, now seemed to mock the very idea of safety. The soundscape told its own story of despair. Automated announcements continued their relentless cycle, their cheery mechanical voices eerily out of place. Flight 372 to Denver has been delayed. We apologize for the inconvenience, echoed through the corridors. A cruel reminder of normalcy, now shattered. Overlapping these were the faint, haunting sounds of life on the brink. Distant screams that sent shivers down the spine, desperate pleas for help that grew fainter with each passing second, and the low, guttural growls of the infected, their unholy hunger resonating through the empty halls like a terrible symphony. Every corner carried the risk of a nightmare. From the dimly lit food court, the clatter of a fallen tray could be heard, followed by hurried, panicked breaths. The darkened corridors of the duty-free shops were filled with overturned shelves, broken glass, and a sense of foreboding that tightened like a vice around the chest. Even the once bright signs pointing toward security checkpoints now seemed to offer little more than a false sense of direction, leading survivors deeper into the labyrinth of terror. The sheer scale of the airport amplified the horror. Its vastness, once a symbol of human ingenuity and connectivity, now served as a haunting reminder of isolation. In every shadow, danger lurked. In every echo, a threat loomed closer. It was a place where the walls felt like they were closing in, the very air pressing down on those who dared to breathe it. And yet, amidst this harrowing environment, pockets of resistance and hope still flickered, fragile but unyielding, waiting to be uncovered. Amid the chaos, a few stood out, individuals who hadn't given up, who refused to be swallowed by the madness. Each of them, in their own way, would play a critical role in the events that followed. Their stories would intertwine, their fates tied to the outcome of this nightmare. A flight attendant, still clad in her crisp uniform, moved carefully through the shadows of Terminal 4. Her name was Emma Carter, and though her hands trembled slightly, her eyes held a fierce determination. She had spent years learning how to stay calm under pressure, handling unruly passengers, comforting frightened flyers during turbulence, but nothing had prepared her for this. Even so, she guided a small group of survivors, whispering instructions and scanning the corridors ahead with laser focus. Every step she took was calculated, every pause deliberate. Her mind raced with memories of the outbreak's onset, of her fellow crew members falling one by one. She hadn't been able to save them, but she was determined to protect those still alive. In another part of the airport, a man named Daniel clutched a small, pink backpack as if it were a lifeline. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing loudly in his ears. Somewhere in this sprawling nightmare was his 8-year-old daughter, Lily. They had been separated when the panic first broke out. One moment she was holding his hand, and the next she had vanished into the sea of terrified travelers. He had searched frantically, calling her name over and over, until the growing sound of the infected forced him into hiding. Now, every breath he took carried the weight of fear and guilt. But he couldn't stop. He wouldn't stop. He had to find her. He replayed the last moment he saw her in his mind, over and over again, hoping to spot a clue he might have missed. A dropped toy, a familiar scarf, anything that would lead him to her. High above the terminals, in the control tower, sat Marcus Chen, an air traffic controller. He watched the chaos unfold below through thick, reinforced glass, helpless to intervene. His station, once filled with the chatter of pilots and the hum of technology, was now eerily silent. The radios were dead, the runways deserted. He had tried to maintain communication with the outside world, to call for help, but static was all he received. Still, he kept trying, his fingers moving instinctively over the controls, hoping against hope that someone would hear him. He knew the layout of the airport better than anyone. If he could just find a way to guide the survivors below to safety, maybe, just maybe, they had a chance. And then there was Jake, a lone traveler who had always preferred his own company to that of others. He was resourceful, practical, and until now, unapologetically selfish. He had managed to stay alive by avoiding the crowds, slipping through unnoticed while others fought to escape. But something inside him was shifting. As he watched a terrified mother clutching her child while trying to pry open a locked door, he hesitated. For the first time in his life, he felt a twinge of responsibility, a need to do something more than just survive. He didn't know why, but he stepped forward, ready to help. It had all started so suddenly. A plane from an international destination had landed just after dusk. Passengers disembarked as usual, some tired from long flights, others eager to begin their journeys. But among them was a man who looked unwell, pale, sweating, with a strange, vacant look in his eyes. He staggered through customs, unnoticed by most, until he collapsed near the baggage claim. Security rushed to his aid, assuming he had fainted. That was the first mistake. Within minutes, he was back on his feet, but something was terribly wrong. His movements were jerky, unnatural, and when one of the security guards tried to restrain him, he bit down viciously on the man's arm. The infection spread rapidly from there. The bitten guard convulsed, his veins darkening as the virus coursed through his body. He turned within minutes, attacking those closest to him. Panic spread like wildfire as more passengers were infected. The terminals, once filled with the buzz of life, descended into chaos. Emma had been at Gate 12 when it happened. She had just finished assisting passengers boarding a delayed flight when she heard the first screams. She turned to see a wave of people running toward her, their faces pale with terror. Behind them, she caught a glimpse of the infected, shambling, snarling figures that moved with terrifying speed. Without hesitation, she grabbed a nearby child who had fallen in the stampede and ushered them toward an emergency exit. That instinct to protect, to help, was what had kept her alive so far. Meanwhile, Daniel had been at a nearby coffee stand with Lily when the chaos erupted. In the confusion, they had been separated, and now he was driven by a single thought: find his daughter before it was too late. Every corner he turned, every shadow he passed, held the promise of either reunion or despair. He clung to hope, refusing to entertain the possibility of failure. Jake, on the other hand, had seen the outbreak begin from a safe distance. He had been heading toward the rental car counters when he noticed the commotion. At first, he thought it was just another travel delay or a protest. But when he saw the first infected lunge at a passenger, he knew This was something far worse. His instincts kicked in and he moved quickly, staying out of sight, finding a place to hide until things settled. Or so he thought. But nothing settled. The chaos only grew. Marcus, isolated in the control tower, had witnessed everything. He had seen the infection spread with terrifying speed, turning travelers into monsters in mere moments. He had tried to call for help, but the response was the same: silence. Now he could only watch and hope that those below would find a way to survive. But hope, he knew, was a fragile thing in moments like these. As the infection spread, so too did the fear. People ran in every direction, desperate to escape, but the airport, once a symbol of freedom and travel, had become a trap. Security personnel tried to maintain order, but it was impossible. The infected moved too quickly, and soon the terminals were overrun. Families were separated, friends lost sight of each other, and in the midst of it all, a few brave souls began to emerge, people who refused to give up, who would fight to survive against all odds. Emma Carter led the group of survivors through the dimly lit corridors, her heart pounding in her chest with every cautious step. The silence between them was only broken by the faint shuffling of feet and the occasional distant growl of the infected. She gripped a flashlight tightly in her hand, the weak beam of light barely cutting through the darkness ahead. Her mind flickered back to the first few minutes of the outbreak, the panic, the chaos, and the faces of her colleagues who didn't make it. Each memory was a weight she carried, one she couldn't shake off, no matter how hard she tried. She remembered Sam, her closest friend among the flight crew. They had been together when the first screams echoed through the terminal. "Go," he had said, pushing her toward safety, while he stayed behind to help a fallen passenger. She had hesitated, her instincts telling her to stay, to fight, but there hadn't been time. She could still hear his voice, sharp and urgent, echoing in her mind. She hadn't seen him since. Now, as she guided the small group toward what she hoped was safety, she felt a gnawing guilt. Every decision weighed heavily on her. She couldn't afford another mistake. Lives depended on her now. Behind her, a man named Daniel scanned the dimly lit terminal with frantic eyes, searching for any sign of his daughter. He held onto a small pink backpack, Lily's backpack, as if it were a lifeline. Every step felt like an eternity. He had been following a trail, piecing together small clues in the hope that they would lead him to her. The first clue had been a stuffed rabbit, one he had given her on her last birthday. He had found it lying on the floor near the baggage claim, a silent beacon calling him forward. "Dad?" he whispered under his breath, imagining her voice calling out to him. He clenched the backpack tighter. The group moved cautiously past an abandoned check-in counter, its digital screens flickering with error messages. Daniel's eyes caught something on the ground, a child's scarf, bright yellow with blue stripes. He knelt down, picking it up with trembling hands. It was hers. He was close. That thought, that hope, was what kept him moving. At the back of the group, Jake watched the others from a distance, his expression unreadable. He had always been a loner, someone who preferred to rely on himself rather than others. Trust, he had learned long ago, was dangerous. It made you vulnerable, and in this nightmare, vulnerability could get you killed. Yet something had shifted inside him since the outbreak began. He couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in his gut. Every time he saw Emma take charge or Daniel searched desperately for his daughter, he had survived by keeping to himself, by avoiding risks. But now, he was beginning to wonder if survival meant something more than just staying alive. They reached a narrow hallway, its walls lined with vending machines and payphones. Emma paused, shining her flashlight ahead. The path was clear, but she knew better than to trust appearances. "Stay close," she whispered, "and keep quiet." Jake stepped forward, his eyes scanning the shadows. He had spent enough time in the dark to know when something was off. "I'll check it out," he said quietly, surprising even himself with the offer. He didn't wait for a response before moving ahead, his footsteps silent on the tiled floor. Emma watched him go, a mixture of relief and concern crossing her face. Jake had been distant, aloof, since they first met, but now he was stepping up. She didn't know why, but she wasn't going to question it. Every bit of help mattered. Behind her, Daniel clutched the scarf tightly, his mind racing with memories of Lily. He could still picture her smile, her laugh. He had to find her. There was no other option. As Jake reached the end of the hallway, he stopped, listening carefully. The sound of something shuffling in the distance reached his ears, a slow, deliberate movement that sent a chill down his spine. He turned back toward the group, signaling for them to stop. Emma raised a hand, motioning for silence. They waited, hearts pounding, breaths held, until the sound faded into nothingness. Jake returned, his expression serious. "We're not alone," he said quietly. "But it's clear for now. We need to keep moving." Emma nodded, leading the group forward once more. Every step felt heavier, every sound sharper. They didn't know what lay ahead, but they knew one thing for certain. They couldn't stop. Not now. Not ever. Daniel's grip on the backpack tightened as they moved. He thought about what he would say when he found Lily. He thought about how he would hold her, tell her everything would be okay even if it wasn't true. He had to believe it. He had to believe that hope was stronger than fear. That love was stronger than despair. Behind him, Jake kept a careful eye on the shadows. He didn't trust easily, but he was beginning to trust Emma. She was calm, capable, and determined. He respected that. And Daniel? Jake couldn't imagine what it must be like to be searching for someone you loved in a place like this. He didn't know if he would have the strength to keep going, but Daniel did. And that made Jake want to help, even if he didn't fully understand why. As they reached the end of the hallway, Emma paused, turning to face the group. "We're close to the control tower," she said quietly. "If we can reach it, we might be able to find a way out. Stay together, stay quiet, and keep moving." They nodded, each of them steeling themselves for what lay ahead. The control tower was their goal, their hope, but getting there would be another matter entirely. The infected roamed the airport, driven by a hunger that couldn't be sated. One wrong move, one misstep, and it would all be over. They moved forward, their steps careful, their breaths shallow. Each of them carried their own fears, their own hopes, their own stories. But together, they moved as one, bound by the shared desire to survive. Far beyond the airport walls, families gathered around their radios, clinging to every word of the broadcast. The fear in their eyes reflected the horror they imagined unfolding within the terminal. Mothers gripped photographs of their children, whispering silent prayers for their safety. Fathers paced anxiously, hoping for a glimpse of familiar names or faces among the survivors. The broadcast had become more than just a report. It was a fragile thread connecting those trapped inside the airport to the outside world. It was a lifeline of hope. One such family sat huddled in a dimly lit living room, the soft glow of the radio casting long shadows on the walls. A woman held a small child close, her fingers trembling as she turned the volume knob slightly. Her husband stood by the window, peering out into the dark, as if expecting the nightmare to spill over into their world. They had a son, a college student, who had been flying home that evening. The woman's heart clenched at every mention of survivors, willing herself to hear her son's name. But there was only static, punctuated by the grim voice of the broadcaster, recounting the unfolding horror. Meanwhile, the military had established a perimeter around the airport, soldiers standing guard with weapons at the ready. Tension hung thick in the air as officers barked orders and medics tended to the few who had managed to escape. Major Collins, a seasoned officer, stood before a hastily erected command post, his brow furrowed in frustration. They had been sent to secure the airport and contain the infection, but it was clear that things were spiraling out of control. "Any word from the inside?" he asked, his voice low but firm. "None, sir. We've tried all channels, but there's too much interference. We're picking up bits of a civilian broadcast, but nothing concrete." Collins sighed, running a hand over his face. He had seen many things in his years of service, but nothing like this. An infection that spread this quickly, that turned ordinary people into mindless predators. It defied logic. He turned to his team. "Keep trying. We need eyes on the ground, and get those evac choppers ready. If we get a window, we're going in." Inside the airport, the survivors continued their cautious advance. Emma led the way, her flashlight flickering slightly as the batteries began to weaken. Daniel followed closely, his eyes darting around, searching for any sign of Lily. Jake brought up the rear, his grip tight on a makeshift weapon, a broken piece of metal he had picked up along the way. Every sound, every shadow, set their nerves on edge. As they moved through the terminal, Emma whispered a few survival tips to the group. "Stay calm, move quietly, and always keep an exit in sight. Panic gets people killed. If you hear them coming, don't run unless you have a clear path." She glanced back at Jake, who gave a curt nod of understanding. He might not have been a team player before, but he was starting to listen. Survival wasn't just about individual instincts. It was about working together. At one point, they reached a moving walkway, its belt frozen in place. Emma motioned for the group to step onto it. "We'll use this to stay elevated. It gives us a better view of what's ahead. And if something's hiding below, we'll spot it first." They carefully climbed onto the walkway, keeping low to avoid drawing attention. Jake scanned the area ahead, while Daniel kept his eyes fixed on the floor, searching for any more clues about Lily's whereabouts. "Survivors used moving walkways to stay ahead of the infected," Emma explained quietly, her voice steady, despite the tension. "It's not just about speed, it's about using the environment to your advantage. The key to survival in this chaos is to stay one step ahead, always thinking about your next move." As they neared the end of the walkway, a low growl echoed from a nearby corridor. Emma froze, holding up a hand to signal the others to stop. They waited, hearts pounding, as the growl grew louder, accompanied by the unmistakable sound of shuffling footsteps. Jake gripped his makeshift weapon tighter, his knuckles turning white. "Stay calm," Emma whispered. "They can't see well in the dark. If we stay quiet, they might pass by." The group held their breath as the infected drew closer. Seconds felt like hours as the growls grew louder, then began to fade. Emma exhaled slowly, signaling for the group to move again. Meanwhile, outside the airport, the tension among the military grew. Reports of infected spreading beyond the airport grounds began to trickle in, each one more alarming than the last. Major Collins knew that time was running out. If they didn't act soon, the infection could spread to nearby cities, turning a contained outbreak into a full-blown catastrophe. Back inside, the survivors reached a large window overlooking the tarmac. In the distance, they could see helicopters hovering, their searchlights sweeping over the runways. Relief flickered in their hearts, but it was quickly replaced by a grim realization. The way to the tarmac was blocked by hordes of infected. Reaching the helicopters would be no easy task. Emma turned to the group, her expression resolute. "We'll find a way. We have to. But we can't rush. One step at a time." She looked at Daniel, who nodded, clutching Lily's backpack tightly. For him, there was no other option. He had to keep going. He had to find his daughter. Jake, for the first time, felt a sense of purpose beyond his own survival. He didn't fully understand it, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to run anymore. He was going to stand and fight, not just for himself, but for the people he had come to care about. As the survivors prepared to move on, Emma's voice echoed softly in the dim corridor. "Remember, stay calm, stay quiet, and always keep an exit in sight." The group stumbled into the duty-free shop, breathless and on edge. Emma closed the heavy glass doors behind them, using a metal luggage rack to block the entrance. Jake quickly scanned the area, checking for any signs of movement among the overturned shelves and scattered merchandise. The once pristine and bustling shop, filled with eager travelers buying last-minute gifts and snacks, was now a chaotic mess of broken bottles, shattered glass, and abandoned goods. "We can't stay here long," Emma whispered, wiping sweat from her brow, "but we need a moment to regroup." Daniel sat down on the cold floor, cradling Lily's pink backpack. His eyes were distant, lost in thought, as he tried to steady his breathing. Every second that passed without finding her felt like an eternity. The fear gnawed at him, but he pushed it aside, focusing instead on the faint hope that she was still out there, waiting for him. Jake rummaged through the shelves, grabbing what few supplies remained. Half-empty water bottles, a couple of energy bars, and a small first aid kit. He tossed the supplies onto a counter, glancing at Emma. "This won't last us long," he said grimly. "If we're going to make it to the control tower, we need to move soon. Staying here is suicide." Emma nodded, knowing he was right. "We just need a plan. The baggage claim area is between us and the control tower. It's crawling with those things. If we try to go straight through, we won't make it." Jake leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. "Then we don't go straight through. We find another way. Maybe through the service tunnels or maintenance hallways. Anything that keeps us out of sight." Daniel, still clutching the backpack, looked up. "I can't keep wasting time. Lily's out there. We need to move." Emma walked over to him, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "We'll find her, Daniel. But if we rush out without a plan, none of us will make it, and she'll be left alone. We stick together, we stay smart, and we keep moving forward." Her words carried a quiet strength, enough to steady Daniel's nerves for the moment. He took a deep breath and nodded. "Okay, but let's not wait too long." Emma turned to Jake. "You mentioned the service tunnels. If we can find a map or some kind of guide, we might be able to avoid the main baggage claim area altogether. Let's search this place. Look for anything useful. Maps, more supplies, anything." The group spread out, carefully navigating the wreckage of the shop. Jake moved quickly, his eyes scanning the walls and counters for anything that resembled a map. Daniel checked behind the counter, rifling through drawers and abandoned items. Emma opened a door labeled "Staff Only," hoping it might lead to something useful. Inside, she found a small office space with a desk, a computer, and a stack of papers. Most of the papers were useless receipts and inventory lists, but tucked underneath them was a laminated airport map. Emma grabbed it and quickly returned to the others. "Got it," she said, laying the map on the counter. They gathered around, studying it closely. Emma traced a path with her finger. "If we go through this hallway, we can reach a maintenance corridor that bypasses most of the baggage claim area. It'll bring us out near the stairwell to the control tower." Jake nodded. "It's our best shot, but there's no guarantee it'll be clear." "There's never a guarantee," Emma said quietly. "We just have to be ready for anything." With the plan set, they gathered their meager supplies and prepared to move. Emma led the way, flashlight in hand, while Jake stayed at the rear, his makeshift weapon at the ready. They exited the duty-free shop, stepping cautiously into the darkened hallway. The air felt colder here, heavier, as if the shadows themselves carried the weight of dread. Every step echoed unnaturally, the sound amplified by the emptiness around them. Emma moved with practiced care, her senses heightened by the lingering danger. Behind her, Daniel clutched the backpack tightly, his mind fixed on one thing, finding his daughter. As they neared the entrance to the baggage claim area, they stopped. The hallway opened into a vast open space filled with scattered luggage, overturned carts, and the remnants of abandoned lives. The conveyor belts, once moving endlessly with suitcases and bags, were now silent and still. But what caught their attention most was the sheer number of infected moving through the area. Dozens of them shuffled aimlessly, their lifeless eyes scanning the darkness. Some dragged their feet along the cold floor, while others stood motionless, heads twitching slightly, as if listening for any sound. The group crouched low, staying out of sight behind a row of overturned benches. "We can't go through that," Daniel whispered, his voice barely audible. "We're not going through," Emma replied. "We're going around. Follow me." They moved slowly, keeping to the shadows, staying as low and quiet as possible. Every step felt like a gamble, every sound a potential trigger for disaster. At one point, Daniel accidentally knocked over a small suitcase. It hit the floor with a soft thud, but even that was enough to send a nearby infected turning in their direction. They froze, holding their breath as the infected shuffled closer. Jake gripped his weapon tightly, ready to strike if needed. The infected paused, sniffing the air, its head twitching erratically. After a tense moment, it turned away, joining the others in their aimless wandering. Emma motioned for the group to keep moving. They made their way around the edge of the baggage claim area, sticking close to the walls. It felt like an eternity before they reached the far side, where a door marked maintenance offered a potential way forward. Jake stepped forward, trying the handle. Locked. He cursed under his breath. Of course it's locked. Emma examined the door, noting the electronic keypad beside it. "It's a security door. There might be a manual override nearby. We just need to find it." Daniel pointed toward a nearby office, its glass walls shattered. "Maybe in there." Jake moved toward the office, stepping carefully over broken glass. Inside, he found a control panel mounted on the wall. He examined it quickly, finding the override switch. He flipped it, and a faint beep sounded from the maintenance door. "It's open," Jake said, returning to the group. Emma pushed the door open slowly, peering inside. The corridor beyond was narrow and dark, but it was clear. She motioned for the group to enter. They filed in one by one, closing the door quietly behind them. For a moment, there was only silence. They took a moment to catch their breath, the tension easing slightly now that they were out of immediate danger. But they knew it wouldn't last. The control tower was still a long way off, and the infected weren't far behind. The maintenance corridor was narrow, dimly lit by flickering emergency lights that cast eerie shadows on the concrete walls. The air was stale and carried the faint scent of fuel and decay. Emma led the way, flashlight in hand, while Jake kept watch at the rear, his grip on his weapon firm. They moved in silence, each step carefully placed to avoid making any noise that might attract unwanted attention. As they turned a corner, a faint but familiar sound echoed through the corridor. An automated airport announcement, its cheerful tones starkly out of place in the grim silence. "Attention passengers, Flight 472 to Los Angeles is now boarding at Gate 16. Emma stopped dead in her tracks, her breath catching in her throat. Jake exchanged a wary glance with her. "That can't be real," he whispered. "There's no way." The announcement repeated, and this time, something was different. The voice was off, too slow, too deliberate, as though something or someone was mimicking the familiar tone. A chill ran down Emma's spine as the realization sank in. "They're learning," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're using the announcements to lure us out." Daniel tightened his grip on the pink backpack, his eyes wide with fear. "What do we do? If they're smart enough to do that, how do we stay ahead of them?" Emma took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm. "We keep moving, quietly. They may be learning, but they're still slow. As long as we stay out of sight and don't draw attention, we can make it. They continued down the corridor, their nerves stretched thin. Every sound, every shadow seemed to hold a new threat. The tension was palpable, each of them acutely aware that the infected weren't mindless anymore. They were adapting. After what felt like an eternity, they reached an emergency exit that led to a service stairwell. Emma tried the handle, but it didn't budge. Locked. She examined the door closely, noticing deep scratches and dents around the frame. Someone, or something, had tried to force it open from the outside. "It's compromised," Jake said grimly. "If we go through there, we'll be walking into a trap." Emma scanned the map they had taken from the duty-free shop. "There's another stairwell on the far side of the terminal. It's farther, but it might be safer." Daniel's frustration was evident, but he kept it in check. "Let's go then. We don't have time to waste." They backtracked through the corridor, retracing their steps as quickly and quietly as they could. The tension was suffocating, every creak of the floor and distant sound amplifying their fear. As they neared the alternate stairwell, the distant sound of shuffling feet grew louder. They weren't alone. "We need to move now," Emma whispered urgently. They picked up their pace, keeping low and staying close to the walls. The stairwell was just ahead, its door slightly ajar, offering a glimpse of the darkened space beyond. Emma reached the door first, pushing it open carefully. The stairs spiraled upward into darkness, but it was their only way forward. As the group finally reached the stairwell, a sudden crash echoed from above. They weren't alone. Emma froze, flashlight aimed upward. The sound of rapid footsteps and guttural growls filled the narrow space, growing louder by the second. "Go!" Emma shouted, waving the group forward. "Get to the top!" Daniel bolted up the stairs, clutching the pink backpack tightly. Jake followed close behind, his weapon at the ready. Emma stayed at the rear, glancing over her shoulder as shadows moved rapidly down the stairs above them. "They're coming!" Jake called out, his voice tense. Halfway up, Daniel stumbled, nearly losing his balance. Jake caught him, pulling him upright. "Keep going," he urged. Daniel nodded, pushing himself forward despite the burning in his legs. The infected were gaining on them, their growls echoing through the narrow stairwell. Emma could see them now, twisted, snarling figures descending rapidly, their eyes glinting with hunger. "Faster!" she urged, her heart pounding in her chest. They reached the top of the stairwell, bursting through the door into the control tower's lower level. Jake slammed the door shut behind them, jamming a heavy metal rod through the handle to secure it. The infected pounded against the door, their growls muffled but relentless. Emma leaned against the wall, catching her breath. That was too close. Daniel sank to the floor, his hands trembling as he clutched Lily's backpack. "We made it. We actually made it." "Don't celebrate yet," Jake said, peering out of a nearby window. "We're not out of this mess. Not by a long shot." The view from the window was grim. The tarmac below was crawling with infected, their movements erratic but purposeful. In the distance, they could see the faint glow of military searchlights, but the way to safety was blocked by hundreds of the infected. Emma approached the window, her mind racing. "We need a signal. Something to let the military know we're here." Jake nodded. "There's got to be something up here. Flares, lights, anything." Before they could continue, the pounding on the door grew louder. The metal rod holding it shut bent slightly under the pressure. They didn't have much time. "Search the room," Emma ordered. "Find something we can use to signal for help. We have to move fast." As they scattered, the sound of the door bending further sent a new wave of fear through the group. Time was running out, and the infected weren't going to wait. Emma scanned the control room quickly, her eyes darting from one panel to another. The space was cluttered with old equipment, monitors flickering with static, and piles of papers scattered across the desks. Despite the chaos, she knew that somewhere in this room was the key to their survival. "There!" Jake pointed to a large control panel near the window. "That's got to be it. Emergency lights and signals." Emma rushed over, examining the panel. Most of the buttons were labeled with faded text, but one stood out. A bright red switch with a warning sign next to it. Emergency signal activation. Authorized use only. This has to be it, she said, taking a deep breath. If we activate the emergency lights, the rescue team will see us. Daniel stood nearby, gripping Lily's backpack tightly. And what about them? He asked, nodding toward the infected swarming below. Won't this just bring more of them? Emma hesitated for a moment, then nodded. It will. But we don't have a choice. If we don't send a signal, no one's coming. Jake grabbed a nearby fire extinguisher, testing its weight. Then we better be ready. Once those lights go on, we're going to have company. Emma placed her hand on the switch, glancing at the others. Everyone ready? Daniel swallowed hard but nodded. Ready. Jake gave her a determined look. Do it. With a deep breath, Emma flipped the switch. Immediately, the control tower was flooded with bright red emergency lights, casting long, ominous shadows across the room. Outside, the runway lights flickered to life, illuminating the tarmac in a harsh, flashing red glow. The signal had been sent. For a brief moment, there was silence. Then, as if on cue, the infected below erupted in a frenzy, their guttural growls and snarls filling the air. They began to move en masse toward the control tower, drawn by the sudden light and noise. They're coming, Daniel said, his voice trembling. Emma grabbed a nearby radio, attempting to contact the rescue team. This is the control tower. We have survivors here. We've activated the emergency lights. Repeat, we have survivors requesting immediate evacuation. Static filled the radio for a moment before a crackling voice came through. Control tower, we see your signal. Rescue choppers en route. ETA, 10 minutes. Hold your position. 10 minutes, Emma repeated, turning to the others. We just have to hold out for 10 minutes. Easier said than done, Jake muttered, peering out the window at the growing horde of infected below. They're coming fast. The first wave of infected reached the base of the control tower, slamming into the doors and windows with terrifying force. The survivors could hear the pounding echoing up through the stairwell, growing louder with each passing second. We need to barricade the stairwell, Emma said. Grab whatever you can. Desks, chairs, anything. Jake and Daniel moved quickly, dragging desks and filing cabinets toward the stairwell door. They piled the furniture high, creating a makeshift barricade. The pounding grew louder, the door shaking with each impact. They're going to break through, Daniel said, fear creeping into his voice. Not if we slow them down, Jake said, grabbing a nearby luggage cart. He wheeled it toward the barricade, wedging it tightly against the door. This should buy us some time. Emma grabbed another fire extinguisher, handing it to Daniel. If they get through, use this. Aim for the head and don't stop until they're down. Daniel took the extinguisher, his hands trembling. You'll do fine, Emma said firmly. Just stay calm and stick together. The pounding on the door intensified, cracks forming in the wood as the infected continued their relentless assault. The survivors braced themselves, gripping their makeshift weapons tightly. Suddenly, the door burst open with a loud crash, and the first of the infected spilled into the room. Jake didn't hesitate. He swung his metal rod with all his strength, striking the nearest infected in the head. It went down instantly, but more were right behind it. Hold the line, Emma shouted, swinging her own weapon, a heavy wrench she had found earlier. The survivors fought with everything they had, using luggage carts and fire extinguishers to hold back the horde. Daniel swung his extinguisher wildly, managing to knock down two infected that had gotten too close. His heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to keep going. He had to. For Lily, Jake was a whirlwind of motion, striking down infected with ruthless efficiency. But even he was beginning to tire. We can't keep this up forever, he shouted over the noise. Just a little longer, Emma replied, glancing at the clock on the wall. 7 minutes. They had to hold out for 7 more minutes. As the infected continued to pour into the room, the survivors began to fall back, retreating toward the windows. The barricade had slowed the horde, but it wasn't enough. They needed another plan. Emma, look! Daniel pointed toward a large industrial-sized cabinet near the back of the room. If we can tip that over, it might block the entrance. Jake, help me, Emma shouted. Together, they pushed against the heavy cabinet, using all their strength to tip it over. With a loud crash, it fell, blocking the majority of the stairwell entrance. The infected continued to pound against it, but for the moment, it held. They took a moment to catch their breath, sweat dripping from their faces. The infected were still trying to break through, but the barricade had bought them precious time. 5 minutes, Emma said, her voice steady despite the tension. We just have to hold on for 5 more minutes. Outside, the sound of helicopter rotors grew louder, cutting through the night air like a beacon of hope. The rescue team was close, but the survivors weren't safe yet. They had one final obstacle, the rooftop. We need to get to the rooftop, Emma said, her voice urgent. The choppers won't land unless they're sure it's clear. Jake nodded, wiping sweat from his brow. Then let's move. We're not out of this yet. The group hurried toward the emergency stairs leading to the rooftop. Each of them knew this was their final chance. Either they reached the rooftop and got on the rescue choppers, or they would be overrun. There was no other option. The infected were still pounding on the barricade below, their growls growing louder with every passing second. As they reached the door to the rooftop, Marcus Chen's voice crackled through the radio they had picked up earlier. I'm watching you from the tower's main observation deck. The signal worked. Rescue is inbound. But there's a problem. Emma grabbed the radio. What kind of problem? The helipad is swarming. There are too many infected on the rooftop. The pilots won't risk landing unless it's clear. Emma clenched her jaw, glancing at the others. We'll clear it ourselves. Marcus hesitated. There's another option. I can manually boost the distress signal to send out a stronger beacon, but it has to be done from here. If I do that, it'll draw the infected away from the rooftop long enough for you to board the choppers. Jake frowned, realizing what Marcus was implying. You can't do that and get out in time. It's the only way, Marcus said calmly. Someone has to stay behind. I can guide you to safety, but I won't make it out. A heavy silence fell over the group. They all knew Marcus was right, but accepting it was another matter. He had been their unseen ally, their guiding voice through the nightmare. Letting him sacrifice himself wasn't something they could do lightly. Emma's grip on the radio tightened. Are you sure? I've been up here since it all started, Marcus replied. I've done everything I can to help from behind this glass. Now, it's time to finish the job. You all have people waiting for you out there. Get to the rooftop. I'll handle this. Emma closed her eyes for a brief moment, then nodded. Thank you, Marcus. Don't waste time thanking me. Just survive. Marcus's voice faded, replaced by the faint hum of machinery as he began boosting the signal. Moments later, the infected below shifted their attention, drawn by the amplified sound coming from the control tower. It worked. The horde began to move away from the rooftop, clearing a path for the survivors. Let's go, Emma said, pushing open the door to the rooftop. The cold night air hit them instantly, carrying with it the unmistakable sound of helicopter rotors drawing closer. They stepped onto the rooftop, finding it littered with debris. Abandoned luggage carts, toppled equipment, and the lifeless bodies of those who hadn't made it. A few infected still wandered the far side of the rooftop, but the majority had moved toward the control tower, just as Marcus had planned. Clear them out, Jake said, gripping his weapon tightly. Working together, the group moved methodically across the rooftop. Emma swung her wrench with precision, knocking down any infected that got too close. Jake fought with a ferocity born from desperation, every strike filled with the determination to survive. Daniel, though terrified, stood his ground, using the fire extinguisher to keep the infected at bay. As they fought, Daniel spotted something lying on the ground, a small crumpled piece of paper. He bent down and picked it up, recognizing the handwriting immediately. It was a note, written hastily in black ink. Dad, I'm safe. I love you. Don't stop looking for me. It was from Lily, Tears welled up in Daniel's eyes as he clutched the note tightly. She had been here. She was still alive. Renewed hope surged through him, giving him the strength to keep going. "Come on!" Emma shouted, snapping him out of his thoughts. "The choppers are almost here." In the distance, 2 military helicopters hovered, their searchlights sweeping across the rooftop. The survivors waved frantically, signaling their presence. One of the choppers began its descent, preparing to land. As they made their way toward the landing zone, the door to the stairwell burst open behind them. The infected, having noticed the choppers, were pouring onto the rooftop once again. "They're right behind us!" Jake shouted. Emma turned, her eyes narrowing. "Keep moving! Don't stop!" Daniel pushed forward, clutching Lily's note tightly in one hand and his backpack in the other. Jake and Emma flanked him, fighting off the infected as they moved. The helicopter touched down, its doors sliding open to reveal armed soldiers beckoning them inside. One by one, the survivors climbed aboard. As Daniel reached the door, he paused, glancing back at the chaos behind him. He thought of Lily, of the promise he had made to himself to find her no matter what. He knew what he had to do. "Go!" he shouted to Emma and Jake. "I'll hold them off." Emma's eyes widened in shock. "Daniel, no!" "I have to find her," Daniel said, his voice firm. "She's out there somewhere. I can't leave without her." Before Emma could respond, Daniel turned and ran toward the far side of the rooftop, drawing the attention of the infected away from the helicopter. He fought with everything he had, buying the others precious seconds to escape. Tears filled Emma's eyes as she climbed aboard the helicopter, Jake close behind. The door slid shut and the chopper lifted off, leaving the rooftop and Daniel behind. As the helicopter ascended, Emma looked down, watching as the infected swarmed the rooftop. She clutched the radio tightly, hoping against hope that Marcus and Daniel had made it somehow. But deep down, she knew the truth. They had sacrificed themselves so that others could live. The chopper soared into the night sky, the city below flickering with the distant lights of chaos and fire. But amidst the destruction, there was hope. They had survived. They had fought, endured, and found a way through the darkness. Emma leaned back in her seat, exhausted but alive. Jake sat beside her, his expression unreadable. They had lost people, friends, allies, strangers who had become more than that. But they had also gained something, the will to keep fighting, to keep surviving, no matter what came next. As the chopper flew toward safety, Emma's mind turned to the future. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for now they had a glimmer of hope, a chance to rebuild, to find others, to keep the human spirit alive. This was only the beginning. The helicopter flew higher, the roar of its rotors drowning out the chaos below. Emma sat near the open door, watching as the airport grew smaller and smaller, its once grand structure now reduced to a scene of burning wreckage and swarming infected. Flames licked the edges of Terminal 4, casting an orange glow against the dark sky. The control tower stood tall in the distance, a lonely monument to the sacrifices made that night. Her grip tightened around the radio in her lap. Marcus had guided them through every step of this nightmare, and now he was gone. Daniel, too, had made the ultimate sacrifice, running into the chaos to search for his daughter. Emma wanted to believe he had made it, that he would somehow find her and survive. But deep down, she knew the odds were slim. Jake sat across from her, staring out at the horizon. His usual guarded expression was gone, replaced by something she hadn't seen before. Gratitude, perhaps, or maybe just the quiet relief of having made it out alive. Neither of them spoke, but the silence between them wasn't empty. It was filled with unspoken words, shared grief, and the fragile hope of a new beginning. As the airport disappeared from view, Emma allowed herself a moment to reflect. They had faced impossible odds, and yet they had survived. Not because they were stronger or smarter than anyone else, but because they had come together when it mattered most. In the chaos of the outbreak, strangers had become allies. Bonds had formed that neither time nor distance could erase. She thought about the people they had lost. Sam, her fellow flight attendant who had stayed behind to help others. Marcus, who had chosen to guide them from the tower, knowing he wouldn't make it out. Daniel, who had risked everything for the chance to find his daughter. Their sacrifices weren't in vain. They had given hope to those who remained. The helicopter banked to the left, heading toward a makeshift safe zone on the outskirts of the city. Below, scattered fires illuminated the streets, and the infected still roamed in pockets of darkness. The fight was far from over, but for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Emma allowed herself to believe that there was a future worth fighting for. As they neared the safe zone, the radio crackled to life. A voice, calm but urgent, came through. "Survivor Chopper, this is Safe Haven Command. You're clear to land. Medical teams are standing by." Emma glanced at Jake, who gave her a faint nod. They had made it. Against all odds, they had made it. The helicopter touched down gently on a marked landing pad. Medics rushed forward, helping the survivors out and checking them for injuries. Emma stepped onto solid ground, the cold air biting at her skin. For the first time in hours, she felt a strange sense of calm. They were safe. For now. Jake stood beside her, watching as the medics worked. "We're alive," he said quietly, as if testing the truth of his own words. Emma nodded. "Yeah, we are." They stood in silence for a moment, each lost in their own thoughts. Around them, other survivors from different parts of the city trickled into the safe zone, each with their own stories, their own losses. The nightmare wasn't over, but this was a beginning, a chance to rebuild, to find a way forward. Emma turned back toward the horizon, where the airport still burned in the distance. The memories of that night would stay with her forever. The fear, the loss, the moments of courage. But she knew one thing for certain. They had survived, and they would keep surviving. For those who made it out of Terminal 4, she thought to herself, the nightmare may be over, but the fight for survival continues. Turning back to Jake, she gave him a small, determined smile. "Ready for the next chapter?" Jake chuckled softly, though there was little humor in his voice. "Do we have a choice?" "No," Emma said, her voice steady. "But we have a chance, and that's enough." For those who made it out of Terminal 4, the nightmare may be over, but the fight for survival continues. The world has changed, and humanity's greatest struggle is just beginning. If you want to know how they rebuild, how they fight to stay alive in a world overrun by the infected, stay with us. Like, subscribe, and join us tomorrow for the next chapter of humanity's struggle. What would you do if you were trapped in an airport during a zombie outbreak? Share your survival plan in the comments below. And if you've listened to this radio broadcast all the way to the end, thank you so much for your support. Don't forget to show your love by subscribing to our channel. Thanks again, and we'll see you tomorrow with another brand new radio broadcast. Stay safe.